now. Okay, so let me share my screen out to you again. And I'm going to jump into Lightroom. And I've broken out a collection here for HDR and panoramic images. And I didn't go out and shoot new ones, obviously, because it's, you know, we're under quarantine right now. So I took some images that I shot last go around for this class, and I'm just gonna kind of re-edit them with you guys to show you. So I'm gonna go ahead and delete that one because that was the actual combined HDR image. But if we look at this first image set here, these, my dogs are howling outside for some reason. These 8 images are the set that I created. So this is actually more than 2 stops in either direction. This is like 3 stops or 4 in either direction. So my middle exposure is probably this number 4 frame right here. And if I look at that, I can see that I have good exposure in the foreground down here, but my sky and everything in the top is completely blown out, right? And let me minimize this. You guys can see in my histogram, as it pushes over, I have most of my information in sort of the mid-tone, highlight mid-tone range, but then I'm pushed off the end of the scale. Everything's clipping up in the highlights, and that's what this is up here, and that's problematic. So if I go back and look at my exposure that looks good for the sky, maybe this one, number 7, right here, I bring that up. You can see I have good detail in the sky. I don't think I have any clipping, and I look on my histogram and I don't have any clipping, but now all the information is pushed down into the shadows, right? And I'm losing a lot of detail in the trees over here and down in the foreground in the rocks, and that's not ideal. So I need some sort of combination of the two, and that's where we use HDR to achieve that. So I'm not gonna use every single image from this set because I think it's kind of overkill. So I'm gonna choose every other one to put this together. So let me just select, I'll go with 7, and then I think I'll go with 1, and probably 3, and maybe 5. I think that looks good. So I'll choose those 4 images. So that's the first step, is selecting the images you want to merge to an HDR. So you could select the whole set, just go 1 through 8, and select them all and merge them, or you could select individually these breakout ones that you think have enough detail and information in them to merge. Once you have your images selected, you simply go up to Photo, and then Photo Merge, and then you see you have 3 options here. In the newest version of Lightroom, you have these 3 options. You have HDR, Panorama, and then HDR Panorama, which is actually a pretty cool option. And I have an example that I'll show you at the end. But I'm gonna stick with HDR right now. So I'm gonna click HDR, and what it does is it brings up this menu, or this window, and it says it's creating HDR preview. So it's merging the files together, and then it's going to show me a preview of that file once it comes up. Now, I have Show Deghost overlay on. That's why you see the red here. So I'm gonna take that off for a second. I'm gonna set my deghost amount to none because we need to talk about that here in a minute. So let me make this a little bit bigger. So what we're seeing now is a HDR preview, and you have 2 settings here, first and foremost. So you have auto align, which you always want to put on, and then you have auto settings, which you can choose to put on or not, and I'll explain what that does here in a second. But auto align is really important because it's going to take your images, it's going to look at the detail that's in the images, and it's going to make sure that all your shots are aligned. So if you accidentally rotated the camera slightly or you panned over a little bit, it's going to take those images, stack them on top of each other so they're perfectly aligned, so you don't have any alignment problems. And then you have these options for deghost. Now, deghost is what I was kind of talking about when we imagine a scenario where we have people walking around in front of a building, right? And then if you take 5 quick shots, you might have the same person repeated 5 times in a row in front of the building. So you can choose these various deghost amounts to take care of that problem, where it'll try to eliminate the duplicates of detail that it sees repeating, and you know, give you a cleaner shot. Now, the problem here with deghosting is that when you delete, let's say there's the 5 people there, right? And you want to keep 1, right? You can only choose the person from one of the frames, right? And the software kind of automatically does that. That means in that area where it's deghosting, it's only using one of the exposure ranges of that shot. So you'll have limited editing capability in that range where it deghosted. So on this shot, let's turn deghost on to low, and I'll put show deghost overlay. So when it comes up, it's going to highlight the areas that it had to fix some problems. So you can see this area here that's red, and these areas up here that are red. It had to delete some of the data out of those areas so it could fix the alignment problems. And what's going on up in the trees is the condition that we talked about, where it's a little bit windy. So these trees were moving around, right? So it's doing a little bit of deghosting. If I go up to medium, go. Why is it going? It's not allowing me to do any more deghosting. It's like a, all right, there we go. So let's go up to high, actually. So if I show my deghost overlay with high deghosting, you can see it's taking the whole upper portion of the image out and replacing that with just one of the exposures. Now that's not great because there's dark areas in the trunks of the trees, there's bright areas in the sky, and there's sort of in between areas in that hillside. And basically what this is doing is just giving me one of my exposures to work with up here. So I'm losing all of my functionality of the HDR by doing the deghost, right? So let's see what medium looks like. So medium is basically just as bad. It's maybe a little bit better down in here, but I'm just gonna leave it on low. I think these areas here that it's identified as problem areas to try to fix are few enough that it's not gonna severely impact me during my editing, but I don't wanna only deal with one sky for my exposure. So I think the deghost low is a good option here. Otherwise, you could just leave it on none, but you might see some repeating and doubling up in the trees here. So that's just something you're gonna have to assess image to image what is acceptable. I'm gonna leave this one on low. And now let's talk about the auto settings. So if I click on auto settings, what it'll do is it'll try to adjust some of the basic settings to make this look more HDR-y, right? So this is with it off, and you can see pretty bright sky, still pretty dark in the details here. With it on, it tries to fix some of that. What this is doing is actually adjusting the sliders in your development module. So when it actually does merge this image and we open it up into development, what you'll see is some of your sliders will already have been moved, right? That's the auto settings. You can always undo them. So there's no harm in keeping the auto settings on. It's not gonna do any permanent adjustments to the image. You can always just undo what it's done. But it also doesn't hurt you either to not have them on, because you can just go through and manually do the adjustments how you see fit. I usually click them on just to get an idea of what it thinks it should look like. And then I merge them with it off. So I'll turn it on just to see, I'll turn it back off, and then I'll hit the merge button to actually create the file. So at this point, I'm gonna create the file, I'm gonna hit merge, and it will do this progress bar of creating HDR image up here on the top left. And then at some point, it'll create a new image in the line. There it is, right here. That's my HDR file that I'm gonna start working with. So I'm gonna bring it into loop view real quick. And you can see the name of it is now whatever the file name was, and then HDR-2. So it's interesting because it retains this file number, and that's why it puts it at some sort of weird place in the line. Like Jennifer, you were talking about how it showed up kind of in the middle rather than at the end. I guess it just chooses kind of arbitrarily, or maybe oh, you know what it does? I picked number 7 first. So it used the number from the first file I chose, right? And then gave that as a name to the new file, but then -HDR-2. And it's -2 because I did this once as practice already for this lecture. It would say -1 otherwise. So this is my file, and you can see it still is a DNG, and that's really awesome because it's still a raw file with our raw editing capabilities preserved. It just took all the raw data from those 4 images and merged it into one file, which is really cool. Some other programs, when you merge into an HDR, it gives you a TIFF file as an output, but doing this all inside of Lightroom allows us to keep it as a raw file and have all of that editing still intact, which is great. Okay, so what we need to do now is go about and start editing this image, right? So I bring it into the develop module. and I would start editing it just like I would any other image. I would look at my overall exposure, I would look at my color temperature, I would look at my contrast, all those sorts of things, and go through my basics tab and just fix those things here. So real quick, something that we haven't talked about yet, just that is a really helpful tool, especially when editing HDR images, but editing in general. In your histogram up at the top right, you have these two little triangles. One's a triangle on the left, one's a triangle on the right. If you turn these on, what they do is they show you an overlay of where you're clipping, both in the highlights and the shadows. So if I look up here, you can see these little red blotches in the sky. That's where my data is clipping right now in the highlights, showing up as red. And then if I come down here in my shadows, where I have this blue, you can see that's where my data is clipping in the shadows, right? So I have some areas in blacks where it's just a true black, some areas in the highlights and the whites where it's a true white. But this helps you visualize it. So when you're doing your contrast adjustments, you can see more specifically where you're clipping, right? So now I'm just gonna go through and start doing my basic edits on this shot and work from there. So I think that the first thing I see is it looks a little bit green. So I'm gonna add a little bit of magenta into it, maybe a little bit of warmth, because I just like the idea of warming this image up a little bit, make some of these earth tones a little bit richer. And I think that looks, well, we could choose to go pretty dramatic with it if we want to and give it this really kind of earthy feel. Maybe that looks nice. Something like that. Yeah, let's leave it there. And then we'll go through and adjust our exposure and our various exposure settings here. So I'm just going to work through kind of quickly, and I'll take a look at my exposure settings. I'm going to go to my highlights, and I'll probably start bringing my highlights down a bit to handle some of that clipping in the sky. Actually, you know what? A good place to start with this, like the other editing tutorials that we looked at, is bringing your highlights down and your shadows up. So I can just go ahead and pull my highlights all the way down, pull my shadows all the way up. That's just a good place to kind of start with and look at things. And you can see a lot of my clipping has gotten taken care of up in the top and the shadows. And then we'll go into our whites and blacks slider and dial in the contrast like we had done before. So again, holding down Option, start adjusting my white slider, and I can start pulling that back up or down depending on what I need. As you see, as I pull it up, all that clipping in the sky comes back. And again, I'm holding down Option while I'm doing this, so it shows me my clipped areas. So I'll pull that down until I have very little clipping, and I'll do the same with my blacks. I'll pull that down, but blacks are all right to have a little bit of clipping in, because you do want a true black in your image to really have a nice contrast. So it's probably something like, maybe not that far, maybe like that. Looks pretty good. And then I can come back up here. Once I've set my contrast in, I can come in with my highlights and sliders and just kind of play with this until I have sort of the range of my highlights that I like. So I'm gonna bring my highlights back up just a bit to give a little bit more brightness up into the sky and the hillside here. But because I have my clipping overlays on up here, I can see what's happening with my white clipping and my black clipping as I'm adjusting my highlights and shadow slider. So that's starting to look pretty okay. It's pretty flat at the moment, but we're gonna handle a lot of that with our local adjustments, and then also in the tone curve down here. So before I get to those things, I want to just take a look at my presence tab, texture, clarity, dehaze, and so on, and just adjust some of these things. So I think for landscapes, actually clarity makes a big difference. So if I turn that up, if I turn clarity way up, you can see it looks like it's getting kind of more contrasty, like a lot more contrasty, but it's not just separation of highlights and shadows, remember, it's more of kind of color contrast. So it's not making my sky a lot brighter. You can see even though I turn my clarity way up, I'm not really clipping any more than I was before. It's just bringing out the separations and the tonalities and giving me more definition and more sort of interest in the shot. And you can see it a lot in the rocks in the stream. So if I go back to 0 again, here's where it was. As I bring my clarity slider up, you can see the highlights on those rocks are getting brighter and stuff, and there's more texture and more separation. 64 might be a little too high. Something maybe like 50 is probably better. And then texture is more of a detail, kind of sharpness thing. So I'm gonna zoom in so that I can see my details here as I play with my texture slider. I'll just bring them up or down just to taste, basically, until I like the texture that I'm seeing. So maybe 30 is sort of all right. And so now you can see if I go before and after, right, it's a pretty big difference already. So this is, again, just with the basics tab. That was before, that was after, or perhaps a better way to look at it is down here in my viewing options. I can select the icon that has the two Y's next to each other, and it's like before and after, left and right, and that'll show me the before and after as a split screen. So that's already done quite a bit. You guys can see I took care of a lot of the kind of blue and cyan that was present in this image. I have a lot more color separation over here between my greens and my browns and my neutral tones. My contrast has been fixed. My overall exposure has generally been fixed. And if you are content with this, you could just stop here and leave it as is, right? Because that is a pretty big difference, and this does look reasonably good. But there's a lot more I can do, and I will walk you through that so you guys can see exactly what I would do if I wanted to push this further. So let's go back to our single view. And now let's start working our way down these various tools here. So I was in the basics tab. Now I want to go into the tone curve. And the reason why I want to go into the tone curve is because it gives me a little bit more fine-tuned control over my contrast and exposure. So I've done most of what I need to do up here. I don't really want to tweak these anymore because it starts throwing off the overall balance of the shot. But now I can add this tone curve in here just to give a little bit more fine-tuned control, a little bit more interest in the shot. So I think I still want even more separation in the sort of mid-tone contrast. So I don't necessarily want my brightest tones to go any brighter or my darkest tones to go any darker, but I would like to have more contrast sort of specifically in the midtones. So I can use these sliders. I have highlights, lights, darks, and shadows. And as I hover over each of them, you can see what area of the histogram it's affecting. So my highlights are the very brightest kind of areas of the histogram. My lights are sort of the upper mids. My darks are sort of the lower mids. And then my shadows are just the very darkest areas. So what I can do is give it a little bit of contrast in these middle two sliders by bringing my lights up a little bit and my darks down a little bit, like maybe even just like +5 in my lights and -5 in my darks. And if I toggle this on and off, you can see it just gives a tiny bit more punch to everything. That was before, that's after. And if you look particularly in the rocks in the stream on the banks on the shore, you can see everything just gets a tad bit more punchy, a little bit darker, but also a little punchier. If you look here, let me go to 2:1, in this kind of path with the leaves, that's with it on, that's with it off. And so you can see what it sort of looks like. It's just the highlights and shadows that are already there, the darker area of the bank, the highlights on the path, the leaves that are speckled in the rocks, they just get a little bit more separation, right? And I could exaggerate this. If I went +10, -10, you would see it happening even more. I don't necessarily agree that this is how it should look, but you can see it just takes some of that contrast, gives it just in the midtones, but I'm not clipping anymore. You can see my shadow clipping is not changing at all as I click that on and off. And my highlights clipping, if I move up there, doesn't change at all when I click it. Well, it changes a tiny little bit, but not in a huge way. So I think that is a little much. I'll back it off a little bit back to kind of more where I had it, something like that. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Okay, so I can, again, just use the tone curve to fine tune these sorts of things. And if you wanted to play with the highlights and shadows tab, you could, or the sliders, and just give it even a little bit more. And we went from that just to that. So it's just kind of punching up that contrast in the middle and giving it a little bit more emphasis. And really in this case, I'm doing it to really make the texture of these rocks more separate and kind of highlight this path that the stream is taking. Okay, after tone curve, then you want to go deal with your color, right? So, and not just the color temperature and tint like we did up here, but more specifically how these different areas of color are rendering. So we have some cool tones in the rocks, we have these greens in the grass and the trees, then we have these warmer brown tones in the path. And I can go into my HSL tool and really deal with those independently and control how I want those specific tonalities to render. So I'm gonna deal with my greens first. Greens are sort of always a problem in landscape photography. They always tend to come out a little bit too punchy and a little bit too saturated. This is borderline looking kind of fakeish. Like when you're in the real world, grass is almost never this vibrant and this green. So what I like to do with my greens typically is shift the hue a little bit and then take the saturation down a little bit. So I'm gonna take my hue tool. I'm gonna grab the little selector, right? The sample adjustment toggle, and I'll bring it out over the image and I'll click on my greens and I'll just drag down or up depending on which way I want them to go, kind of dial that in. So in this case, I want to drag down and just bring that green back towards something that's, you know, we started around here, and then I just want to pull it down just a bit. So some of that like real kind of, you know, almost fluorescent looking green gets dyed down just a bit. Maybe that's a little too much. Something like that, right? So we just take those greens from there to there, just push them a little bit more towards yellow, towards orange. And then what we can do is go into our saturation tool, grab the same sampling toggle tool, and I'll just bring that down a touch too in the saturation, so it's not quite so punchy and vibrant. So I went from that, which now that you can see the before and after, that looks pretty fake to me. That looks a whole lot more natural in the scene. So I think that looks pretty good. Now I want to deal with my cool tones in the rocks. So I'll come back out here and I will use my space bar. See, I still have my saturation tool selected and I still have this sampling tool. So you can see when my cursor's over the rocks here or the river, I have that tool still selected. But if I hold down space bar, I get the hand, and then I can click and drag around my image to get to the area that I want, right? So in this case, I want to deal with the cool tones in this rock. So again, same process. I'm going to go back to the hue, and I'm going to click in the cool tones, and I'll just drag up and down and see which way I want them to go. So right now, they're kind of a little bit on the cyan side. They have this kind of aqua color. And I want to push them more down into the kind of blues. So maybe somewhere around there. I don't want to go quite to like purple, which would be like that, but somewhere in the kind of darker blues rather than be sort of aqua and cyan, I think looks better. So yeah, so I brought that down from there, which is looking kind of like gray and drab, and just bring in a lot more of those cool tones in the blues. And the reason I'm trying to emphasize those blue tones is because I have these warmer tones that I'm playing that color off of. So you see I have these reflections of kind of yellow and orange in the stream. I have the browns over here in the dirt. And when you have these warm colors and cool colors next to each other, if you can create separation, make the warms a little bit more warm, the cool is a little bit more cool, then you give yourself a lot more interest and dynamic in the color of the image. So that's what I'm trying to do right now. So I just dealt with the blues and the hue. Now I can take that saturation tool and I can come to the same rock and bring it. I could go way up and it looks crazy, and that's not what I want to do. But what I can do is give it a little bit more saturation so that that color, those blue colors, just come through a little bit more. They get a little bit out of the gray range and up into actually the sort of cool blues that I want here. Again, I don't want to push this too far because I don't want it looking really unnatural. I just want to take the separation that already exists, the natural color separation, and emphasize it by just pushing it up in either direction. Okay, now I'm going to deal with these warm tones here in the stream. And I probably want to see the whole image when I'm doing this, because if you look at the warm tones here and then the warm tones up in the hill, those are the same general range. And when I start affecting the one, it's going to affect the other. So I need to make sure whatever I'm doing down here doesn't push the area up in the hill too far. So again, go back to my hue. And in this case, I am going to zoom in because I want to see more specifically what's happening. But I want it to go more into that kind of orange and red tone. So it was, again, about here or so. I just want to push it to about, maybe that's too far, right about there. And then I can come back out and see if that's kind of too crazy up in the hill. And it's a little bit too crazy. So I'm going to come back up in the hill now and just take that back up a little bit. So I guess kind of find a balance between the two areas. And you could go back and forth. It might be that the hill has more yellow in it and the stream has more orange in it. So if you can kind of work them back and forth until you get something that that you like, then that tends to be a good way to go. So now you can see I've brought out those warm tones in the stream. Again, I'll zoom in so you guys can see better. Those warm tones in the stream got richer, right? They're looking kind of greenish yellow here. by doing my adjustment, it allows them to take on that really rich kind of brownish orange tonality. And then I'll just do one more area here, which is the path. And I think I'll be done with my hue saturation tool. So just grab this. I probably actually want this to go a little bit less red, but then I want this to be a little bit more saturated. So I'm going to grab my saturation tool, kind of bring those warm tones up just a bit to about there. And you can see if I click this on and off, you can just see how much more color information I got. And I took out a lot of that green in the first step in the basics tab in the warmth and tint sliders, but you can see how much is still present when I click this on and off. So that's off, that's on. So you can see that there's still a sort of this overall greenish tint over everything. And by doing my HSL tool, I've separated out all those colors, gotten rid of that green, and it looks a lot better. So always helpful to again look at where we've come from. So I'm going to go back to my side-by-side before and after, just so I can see what I've done. So again, pretty dramatic result just from going through the global adjustments. We haven't done any local adjustments yet to bring out even more emphasis, but this is starting to look pretty good. I really like the way that the foreground is. I'm not super happy yet with the way that the sky and the hill in the background look, but I'm going to use some local adjustments to deal with that next. But before I get to that, there's a couple more things down here that I want to get to. One of them is the detail tab, which is where we can do a little bit more sharpening to really get our detail in the foreground to look nice. And now it's not that it doesn't look nice right now, but it does look a little tiny bit soft, as you can see probably on your screen. So I think I mentioned in one of the previous tutorials that you always want to sharpen your images, and how much you sharpen is usually dependent on the lens you're using. So in this case, I was using the 24 to 105 millimeter f4 lens on the Canon camera. And I know from shooting this lens that I always need about 70 sharpening, to add about 70 sharpening to the image to get it to look real crisp. And that's just because that's how much distortion is present in that glass. So if I bring my slider up, you can see I just bring out all that detail. And in this case, I'm up around 80. But what you can, I'll get to an area where it's a little bit more apparent, where you can see some of the pebbles and stuff. If you look at the before and after, you can see there's a whole lot more sharpness in these rocks. I can even click this on and off. So that's off, on. You can see how much sharper it got. And it's not that it wasn't like sharp, or it wasn't, out of focus before. It's just that that lens has a little bit of softness to it. And so I need to correct for that in my sharpening. It's usually a good idea to reduce your color noise in general. So you have noise reduction up here. Luminance is like the speckling you see in if you use a higher ISO, you get that sort of light and dark speckling. And then you have color noise, which is like the green magenta speckling that you see. And color noise is a lot more problematic than the luminance noise. So I usually bring my color noise slider up to 75 or something like that, or more if it's necessary. This was shot at a low ISO, it's ISO 100, so there's really not that much noise, but it's always a good idea to bring your color noise slider up. And then this image doesn't need any luminance noise reduction, but if it did, you could bring that up a little bit. But I would be careful with that, because as you bring the luminance noise reduction slider up, you start getting rid of detail. So you guys can see on this rock, it's very light speckling. There's this light and dark speckling in the surface of that rock. If I start bringing my luminance noise slider up, it starts softening out that rock until eventually it gets this really weird kind of plasticky look to it, where it doesn't even look real anymore. So you don't want to be very heavy-handed with your luminance noise reduction. Maybe like 10 or 20 in some cases is sufficient, but I can see it already affecting the rock. So I don't want to do any in this image. I think it's working against me in this case. Okay, so that's detail. The last thing that you want to do in detail is the masking. And you will notice that there's some things I want to sharpen, like the rocks, and some things I don't. Like I don't need to sharpen the water because it's soft and it's kind of this foggy look because it was flowing, right? And there's no need to sharpen that because there's no detail in that. So with the masking tool, if you grab the masking slider and again hold down Option, as I start pushing over to the right, you can see that the areas that are getting black are not having the sharpening adjustment applied to them. So the water in the stream, some of the bark on the trees, it's, as I go further and further, it's removing the sharpening I've done from those areas and applying them only to the areas where the strongest detail is present. So you do usually want to do this whenever you do sharpening, because you never need to sharpen skies. You typically don't need to sharpen people's skin all that much. It's like kind of not ideal to sharpen people's skin. So areas that are smooth, it won't sharpen. Areas that have texture, it will sharpen. So something maybe like that in the case of this image is good. So I didn't apply my sharpening to the water. That still looks nice and soft, but it did apply the sharpening to the rock, right? Okay, let me go back to my single view. Okay, so that's the detail tab. And then the last thing I want to do for right now is my lens correction tab. Now, if you look down here, you'll see that there's some weird kind of like turquoise highlights on the edges of some of these rocks, right? You can see it here, you can see it here, you can see it on these rocks. That's chromatic aberration, and that just happens because of the way the light passes through the lens. When you have a strong highlight next to a shadow, it doesn't do that transition very well, and it causes this kind of color fringing that can look kind of ugly. And it's happening a lot up here in the trees as well. Let me turn off my peaking so you can see it. This purple up here in the trees, that's this kind of color fringing that's happening. I know just from editing this image, it's not going to remove this purple entirely when I turn on the adjustment, but it should get rid of the turquoise that we see down here in the rocks. So what you want to do is you want to check the box under lens corrections for remove color aberration. And when I do that, you'll see that all that turquoisey lines disappear. And if I turn that off, you can see they're back. Now they're gone. So that's great. And we can look to see if it did anything to help us up in the trees. So that's off, that's on. Yeah, I mean, it took it down some. Some of this is like the problem of the ghosting in the HDR merge. It's like there's these areas that are moving and it doesn't really know what to do with them. So that's not great up in the trees, but you know, we'll live with it because you don't see it very much when you're zoomed out. But it helped a lot with the areas down here. It took all of those little turquoisey highlights out, and now we look a lot nicer in our foreground. And then one thing you can choose to do or not is enable profile corrections. So I'll click it on, you'll see what happens. It sort of, you know, flattens out the image. When I take it off, you can see it almost has this bulge in the center. That has to do with the curvature of the glass in the lens. And when you enable the profile corrections, it kind of removes the distortion that's being created by the curvature in the glass, and it makes everything nice and flat and straight. I actually like what it's doing in this image. The distortion that's at the bottom, when it corrects for that, I think looks nicer. It elongates this foreground detail, this rock. It makes it look a little bit flatter and straighter. So I'm going to choose to leave it on. But again, if I click it off, you can see the shape of those rocks in the foreground change pretty dramatically. And it actually gives me a little bit more depth in the image. It makes the area in the center of the stream a little bit smaller, the area in the foreground a little bit bigger, so it sort of elongates the depth in my image, which I think actually works well in this case. So it's always a good idea to have these two things checked. And in some cases, I don't enable profile corrections because I just see the distortion that it's creating is actually working against me in the image. But in this case, I like it. So I would assess image to image whether or not you want to have profile corrections on. But I would think that the majority of the time, you probably do want it on. Okay, we've gone through most of our global adjustments at this point. And again, looking from before and after, we've done a lot of work on this image and it looks a lot better. Now remember, this is the merged HDR. This isn't even just one of the exposures. This is the HDR after it came out and merged, and then this is where we were able to edit it to get it looking good. But there's still more work to be done, and that's with the local adjustments here, and primarily the graduated filter tool, which is this rectangle up here, the radial filter tool, which is the circle, and then the brush tool, which I'll show you how that works here in a second. I'm gonna start with the graduated filter tool, and the main thing I wanna do with this is I want to take some more exposure down just out of the sky, right? And I don't want to do it necessarily by bringing my highlights down because that'll start to make it look a little bit flat. What I want to do is grab this tool, click and drag and create a line here, and then position it where I want. And maybe about there, and then bring some, I'll reset the sliders here. Just bring some of the exposure down. Maybe just there. I could bring my highlights down a little bit. I maybe even want to bring down my saturation a little bit just to take care of some of that super punchy yellow that's up there. Or actually, maybe I want to, instead of bringing down the saturation, I want to add some cool tones. Yeah, that looks better. So put some cool tones in my temperature slider there. And I can just click this on and off, and you can see what it's done is it brought that exposure down up there. Now, the problem is it's also bringing exposure down on the branches of the trees and on some of the leaves. So I really only want to bring the exposure down on the sky and the hill behind it, but this is a really complicated area with these dark branches in front of the sky. So a really super cool tool that you have in Lightroom is called Range Mask. Down at the bottom of your tool panel over here, you have this Range Mask tool. And when I click it, I can mask by color or mask by luminance. In this case, I'm going to choose luminance. And let me just show you what this does. So when we activate the Range Mask luminance tool, we can have this range, right? We have the range slider and we have the smoothness slider. Now I can hold down Option like I do with my other tools. I can grab the left-hand side of the range slider, which relates to my shadows. And when I slide this up, it's basically telling the software to remove this adjustment, this minus exposure, minus highlights adjustment from anything that is below the, this left-hand slider. And so imagine this is a histogram going from your blacks to your whites, right? If I move this slider up, and again, I'm holding down Option, it's taking that adjustment off of anything that in the tonal range below where I have that slider. So you can see it's coming off those branches, it's coming off the leaves because they're getting darker, but it's still being applied to the sky and the hill behind it, right? And the white areas show you where it's being applied. So I think that looks about right. And now you can see that my branches, and particularly this leaf cluster up here, came back up. So I'll go over to my history. Let me fill up here so you can see it a little bit better. Now if I go into my history here and I go just back before I made my luminance mask, you can see how much darker those branches and those leaves were. If I go after my luminance mask, all that comes back up, but the hill and the sky behind it remain the same. So applying that mask allowed me to select just the bright areas in between all the leaves and branches and not affect the branches themselves. So that luminance mask is a really super helpful tool. And it's actually a relatively new tool. In some of the older versions of Lightroom, they don't have that as an option, this masking. You only had the graduated filter tool, just the area that you select is being impacted. So definitely use that luminance mask when it's appropriate. In this case, it was very appropriate, right? So now that I have this masked off and I have my line where it is, I can kind of, again, go back and adjust anything that I want to. Maybe I do want to bring my exposure down a little bit more and just kind of tweak that until it looks good. Maybe something like that, right? And if I click on and off this adjustment as a whole, you can see I went from that really bright area in the background, and I just brought it down a bit, made it so it doesn't pull so much attention up to the top, lets your eye kind of come back down to the stream where you want it. And sometimes something that people do with landscape images is, you'll see this in one of the tutorials up there, is that they just bring a graduated filter tool up over the bottom and kind of move it down so it just sort of gently fades in. And they just give it a little bit minus exposure to kind of close off the bottom of the image, something like that, just so you have a dark area at the bottom so your eye doesn't tend to wander off the bottom of the frame. In this case, I don't think that that's necessary. I don't necessarily like that it's already sort of darker at the bottom. I don't really need to make that adjustment. Maybe just a little bit here, just like that. But I don't want to start darkening down this rock too much because I want that to be sort of one of the main focuses in the image. So maybe I'll just leave it like that. It's not a huge adjustment, as you can see, but it does, a little bit of something to kind of close off the bottom of the image. That's not bad. All right, I'll leave it there. All right, let me get out of the graduated filter tool here. Now, where really the work is going to happen, and the thing that's going to make this image, pop even more than it does, is with the radial adjustment tools. So the radial adjustment tool, you have the same general controls as you did in the graduated filter tool, your exposure and saturation, all these sorts of things. But now we can start applying these effects more selectively around the image. Now, a lot of times people refer to this as your dodging and burning tool. So making certain areas lighter, certain areas darker, and that's the way I'm going to use it right now. And what I want to do is really look at the image and see where my darker areas are, my lighter areas are, particularly in the bottom half of the image. And I just want to push those a little bit further. So I want to make my lighter areas a little bit lighter, my darker areas a little bit darker. So again, it just gives it more dynamic range, more contrast in that region. But the first thing I want to do is bring this back area up. So my eye wants to travel along this stream into the back over here. Right now, it's being sort of truncated down at the bottom. I have most of my detail, most of my highlights down in the bottom hand, or the bottom side here. And my eye doesn't necessarily follow this path up because it gets a little bit darker up here. So the first thing I'm gonna do is just draw radial adjustment tool. I wanna make sure that it's inverted, so I'm affecting the area that's inside of it. And then I'm just gonna give this a little bit plus exposure back here. Something like that, right? And you can mess with this a little bit. You can like give it a little bit more contrast or something too, maybe bring the shadows down a little bit. But generally speaking, I just want a little bit of plus exposure in the center of my image in this case, because that's where I want the eye to go to. And if I click that on and off, you can see I went from that to that. And it just helps brighten up that scene back there. And it does start pulling my eye in. From here, I just want to start selectively adding a little bit of plus exposure to these different areas that need them. So what you can do is you can right click on the radial filter that you've drawn and hit duplicate, and it'll make a copy, and then you can pull that over and start placing it where you think you need a little bit more exposure. So maybe on the rock down here, I could use a little bit more exposure, maybe not that much, maybe not that big, but something like that. And you can readjust your, the size of your radial filter, and then I'll duplicate this again. I'll bring some kind of over here, and then, yeah, that looks fine. And then I'll duplicate it again and bring some over on the path over here, because I want to kind of highlight this path, right? So, but I'm going to change the shape and the size of this again so that it fits that path a little bit better. Something like that. And then just look for any areas that you think need a little bit more exposure. So I'll give a little bit more down here to this rock. And you'll just kind of keep working in this way, duplicating this plus exposure filter around until you have what you need. I'm going to bring a little bit up here on the hill. Let's make this a little bit longer. Something like that. And I could probably kind of keep fussing with this, but for now, that looks pretty good. And again, if I click this on and off, you can see went from that to that. So just more interest in the foreground, brightened up some certain areas. And now what I would do is the same process, but opposite. So I'll create a new radial tool here. I'll give it minus exposure in this case, darken things down, and then I'll just try to decide where I want a little bit of burning to happen, a little bit of minus exposure, areas to get a little bit darker. So maybe down here at the base of this tree, I can duplicate this and give some up, kind of appear on the side of the path, duplicate it again, maybe give a little bit of minus exposure down the bottom, down here, where it goes into the water, where it dives in. And I'll just kind of keep working until I've burned all the areas that I want to burn, right? So something like that. And then down in this corner, definitely, I think I want to do a little bit more minus exposure. And then you would keep working your way around until you've done all the burning that you want to do. So, and again, I want to emphasize that you should be looking at the areas that already have sort of shadows and dark tones and make those a little bit darker, and looking at the areas that already have highlights and making those a little bit lighter. So like this grass here has highlights, so I want them to be a little bit brighter, but this area of the shadows where that grass comes down, I could stand to make that a little bit darker, which is what I'm doing right now. And you can see that it just helps just add contrast and interest back in the back. So let me zoom in actually on that particular area, because I think that's a good example. When I click this on and off, you can see it was all kind of relatively even over here in the grass and the trees. And when I click it on, you can see it just has more separation and more, again, interest and texture and all that in that area. And I think that looks nice. So that's all I'm going to do at the moment with the radial tools. And the last thing I want to do is the brush, the magic brush tool. So again, same exact set of settings. The only difference is that you can use this brush to paint in areas that don't necessarily lend themselves well to a radial tool or a graduated filter tool. So in this case, I want to like darken this bank, but like it's this kind of winding line that I want to darken, and I wouldn't be able to make a tool that kind of fits that path. So what I'll do is just create a new adjustment. I'll bring my exposure down. And then with your scroll wheel on your mouse, you can make this brush bigger or smaller, right, to fit the size you need. And you can see there's two circles. It's a little bit hard to see in this image, but there's an inner circle and an outer circle. So the inner circle is where the effect will be applied 100%, and the outer circle is how much it's gonna feather off. So that'll be the kind of region where it fades out. So I want it to be something like this for my bank here. And so I'll just paint this in, darken that up a bit. And you have some controls over this. So you see you have size, feather. Size and feather was what I just talked about. It's the inner circle and the outer circle. So size is the overall size of the brush. Feather is how big that outer circle is. And then you have density down here, which is what percentage it basically gets applied every brush stroke. So if I put it at 100%, every time I clicked, it would apply 100% of the effect that I just created in that area. I put mine down to about 30% so that I can click multiple times and bring the image slowly, or rather bring the adjustment slowly in as I paint, just because I don't necessarily want to commit to putting that full adjustment in every single place that I click. Sometimes it needs a little bit more in some areas, a little bit less in other areas. So again, I'll just keep working with my image here and start burning in the areas that I think need burned. So I'm going to look at these rocks actually now, and the shadowed area of the rocks I'm going to burn in so I get more you know, kind of contouring with the rocks. So down here and here, on the side here, certainly on the back side of this rock, and underneath here. And I'll just kind of click around with this brush, readjusting the size of it as I go, just to do, you know, what I need to do. And I kind of want this to be darkened up back here a little bit. And again, you could spend all day doing this and fine tuning, but I'm just going to try to do it kind of quickly so that we can see the end result. Maybe this should be a little bit darker. It's down here. And you could do, you know, burning with this tool as well. Or rather, yeah, dodging with this tool as well. So right now I'm burning, I'm making things darker. If I wanted to make certain areas lighter, I could. No, I don't like that last one. Let me step back in my history before I add that last brush stroke. There we go, looks better. But you could, you know, create a new brush and give plus exposure in the same way. Anywhere where you think you need plus exposure, start adding that in. So again, following the paths that already exist to kind of give us a little bit more interest in the image. Something like that. And I don't know, I mean, this is probably unnecessary at this point, but I'll just do it as an example. Okay, and you could go on, but I won't. And I think that looks pretty good. I'm just going to go back to my graduated filter adjustment up here because I still think this is a little bit too bright. And I'm going to just take that down even a little bit more. Bring down my highlights, my whites, and a little bit in saturation because I just think it's a little bit too punchy still. And I think that looks better. Okay, so I'm going to go out of my local adjustment tools. And again, we can go side by side before and after. And now you can see even bigger difference, even bigger separation between the two images. And if I just click on and off the before and after using my slash key on the right hand side, you can see that's before, that's after. And you can see how much more interest and you know, kind of complexity I've added with the local adjustment tools in the foreground in particular. I really like what's happened with the path here on the right hand side. You can see it was pretty kind of flat and boring before, and now with my local adjustment tools, I've added a lot more interest in the highlights in the top and darkened down the bank to try to shape that path as it goes back. Same with the river and the stream as it goes along here. I could probably do more to bring out some of the water, some of the interest in the water, the reflections. And actually, since we're talking about it, I think there's a really easy way to do that. I'll create a new radial adjustment tool that kind of goes over the general shape of the water. Yep. Here we go. I'm going to rotate it so it kind of fits the shape a little bit better of that stream. And then what I'll do, I won't do anything with exposure, but I'm going to add clarity. And you can see as I add clarity, it brings up those reflections in the water and kind of makes that pop a little bit more. And maybe even some saturation just to bring some of those warm tones to life. And I think if I copy this once, sorry, if I copy this filter, duplicate it, and kind of move it down here, I don't want it to necessarily apply to that rock so much. I just want it on the kind of area of the water down here. Something like that, maybe. I think that that definitely helps the water look a little bit nicer. So again, before, after, and I think that that looks pretty good. The very last thing I'll do to this image is just give it a little bit of a vignette. So I'll just darken down the corners to, again, hopefully bring focus into the center of this image. And the way I'll do that is go to the Effects tab and then take my vignette amount and just slide it down. It's going to start darkening down the corners of the image and bring my eye. That's probably a little too much. Something just subtle like that. And it just kind of helps, again, bring my eye into the middle of that frame. So I'm going to turn off my clipping now so you can see the whole image as it stands. I'll give you a side-by-side before and after. And you can see kind of how far we've come with that image just through those few editing steps that we've done. All right, that's enough of me talking. Let's open it up to questions. Do you guys have anything that you saw there or wanted some clarity on any of those steps?
Actually, yeah. With that magic brush, once you've actually created your strokes, can you edit it to expand it? So you can set what that stroke is, and then you can tweak the crap out of it until you're happy with how big it is or how much fall off.
Yeah, basically you can add to it. So I'm back in my magic brush tool, and I have my highlight, my my dodging that I've done, and if I hover the mouse over it, you can see where it's painted it in. And then over here I have my burning. So I have two separate tools basically going on. That's why I have these two little gray dots. The one represents my burning tool, one represents my highlight tool. So when I go into here, let's say I want to click and add more burning, I can just continue painting in. So I don't necessarily change the shape of the original stroke, I just paint more in. Or you can go to erase and erase it off.
So it's additive or subtractive, but not necessarily editable once you've applied it. You have to really choose how big that fall off is going to be, and you can just keep layering in with the density.
Exactly.
Okay.
Whereas the radial adjustment tools, you can come back and edit those specific radial adjustment tools. So like, for example, I could get this one, I could change the shape of it, I could change the feather of it if I wanted to after the fact. But with the brush tool, you simply add or subtract.
Got it. Okay. So you have to really kind of have your idea of how big you want it and whatnot. So there's no way to manipulate like what that stroke movement is or anything like that.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you could erase it, or you could go back in the history and undo it, or you could just delete it altogether. So if I want to just delete everything I've done on this tool, I would select it and then delete, and then it'll get rid of all of the strokes. But I don't want to do that in this case, obviously.
So I have one additional quick question. Is in the upper left corner, you have got the name of the file and the specifics on it. I could not figure out how to bring that up on my monitor.
So
so
it's with the I key on your keyboard. So when you're in library or developed, when you're in loop view, when you're in the single view, you hit the I key and that brings up that information.
Okay.
Yeah. Anybody else? There's still people here. I'm going to stop my share screen to see who's around still. Okay, there's still some people here. Oh, hi, Joyce. How are you doing? No, maybe Joy can't talk to us, or Joyce can't talk to us. Okay. So I guess what we should do is move on to the panoramic and show you kind of how to do that. So I'll share my screen back out here in a second, but let's talk a little bit about shooting panoramics. Just like we talked about shooting HDR and what you want to be thinking about, let's talk about shooting panoramics and what you want to be thinking about in that case. So again, tripod is necessary. That's the very first step, is that you definitely need a tripod. And when you're setting up your shot, you're going to need to basically define where you want it to start and stop ahead of time. Before you even kind of look through your lens, you want to look at the landscape that you're photographing or the object that you're photographing and say, I definitely want my left boundary to be here and my right boundary to be here, right, in the field of view. So usually you can kind of look up and say, okay, there's this palm tree on the left that I definitely want to be in the shot. And then there's like this fire hydrant on the right that I definitely want to be in the shot. So that you know where you're starting and stopping your panoramic. Once you've defined the boundaries, so where you want the top and bottom to be, where you want the two sides to be, then you need to figure out basically how many frames you're going to be shooting. So when you're shooting a panoramic, what you do, the first step is to find your settings, right? So look at the light meter, find your settings for your scene, and then focus, find your area of focus, right? So in the case of the shot we were just working on, the stream that's kind of going into the distance, I knew I needed to focus. I'll share my screen out actually so I can show you. I knew I needed to focus on these rocks down here because that was going to take up, you know, a third to a half of the image. And if I didn't have my focus right on the money on these rocks, and if it was slightly soft, then that was going to be problematic. So when I focused this image, I focused on the rocks in the foreground. When you're doing a panorama, you need to think about where the primary focus of interest is in the shot and set your camera's focus to that point. So you can use your autofocus, focus on the thing that you know is the primary interest, whether it's a building, that's the primary subject, could be the foreground. If you're doing a landscape and there's like wildflowers or something in the foreground and the mountains in the distance, you'd want to focus on the foreground. This is important, right? Because you're going to focus your camera, and then once it's focused, you're going to switch it over to manual focus so that you lock that focus in place. Because then what you do with the panoramic shot is you take a series of images panning from left to right or right to left, whichever you prefer, but you take a series of images as you're panning. And if you're changing your focus each time, right, then some shots might be focused on the foreground, some might be focused on the background. And when you merge them together, just like in the HDR, you don't want to change your depth of field. In the panorama, you don't want to change your area of focus because you might have a seam where a rock goes from in focus to out of focus on the seam because your focus changed in that exposure, right? So you're going to lock in your focus by switching your camera back to manual focus, and then you'll shift your camera over. Let me stop my share at this point. You'll shift your camera. There's a cat in the screen. You'll shift your camera. Oh no, it's fine. I thought my dog was sleeping behind me, but apparently she left. Anyway, so you'll shift your camera over to the left-hand side where you want the image to start, and then you'll make your exposure. You'll take that picture, right? And then what you'll do is you'll pan over so that whatever was in the center of your first frame is now on the left-hand side of your next frame. The reason that you want this is you need overlap when you're shooting a panoramic, because what the software will do is it'll look at the two images and it'll try to identify features of the image that are the same, and then it'll align those features. And if it doesn't have enough area of the image to try to overlap and align and adjust, it won't stitch together properly. So you want at least 40 to 50% overlap from shot to shot. So what I always recommend is whatever is dead center in the frame on your first shot, when you pan over, make sure that that object is visible just on the edge of your next shot. And then you continue doing that until you get to where you want your image to end on the right. So you'll create this full field of images, each with 50% overlap from the last, and then that's how you shoot them. So a couple of things that can be kind of tricky with panoramics is the focus issue, right? So you need to lock your focus in and make sure that doesn't change. You still have the problem of like moving people, right? So if you're doing a panoramic and somebody's walking across and moving the same direction as you're moving with your camera, they'll get repeated in each frame. And so there is, again, some features to fix problems like that, but it's problematic. So again, still things are good to shoot with this method, things that aren't going to be moving around a lot. But then your exposures can be a little bit tricky as well. As you imagine, if you're doing like 180 degree 180 degree panorama, right? That you're starting at the left, focusing on the sunset, and then you pan over to the right, focusing on the clear other side of the horizon where it's darker. Your exposure range is going to be kind of really dynamic. When you're shooting to the left, it's really bright. When you're shooting to the right, it's really, really dark. Now, you can't really change your exposure as you go across. Obviously, whether you try to seam them, it'll be different, right? Because you have these objects that are the same in each frame. And if one shot has +1 exposure and the next shot has -1 exposure, that rock that's in the foreground, one will be bright and one will be dark, and it won't know how to seam those together. It won't blend them appropriately. So you cannot change your exposure settings while you're doing the panorama. You just have to find one that's going to work for your bright side and for your dark side. Now, yeah.
So what if you bracket? So if you were to do like, you know, a 3-frame bracket, like doing it instead of doing 2 stops like you would for HDR, doing 1 stop either side and then bracket along.
Yes, so that is possible to do, and that's what the whole HDR panorama is basically. So basically what you would do is for every exposure in your panoramic set, you would do an HDR exposure. So you just like you said, if you bracketed it, you have +1, -1. So, and I'll show you an example that I did that for one of these shots. And Lightroom's cool. It has a new feature where you can do an HDR panorama merge all in one go, where you don't necessarily have to merge all the HDRs together and then merge all of those together for a panorama. You can do it all in one shot. Now there's a little bit of a tricky thing with that I'll show you when we try to do it, but that is possible to do. Yeah. But if your thing that you're photographing is relatively consistent in light across the range of the panoramic, then you don't really have to worry about that so much. Okay, so and another important thing when shooting the panoramas is making sure that your tripod itself is leveled out. As you imagine, if your tripod's like leaning to one side and you're panning along that lean, if I'm pointing this way, I'm going to be pointing up. As I pan over this way, my camera's pointing down, right? So you need your tripod to be leveled out so that when you're panning across, your camera is level. So you can usually kind of just eyeball that, and you can test it. Like you can look and you can pan across and kind of align the bottom of your frame with the horizon. And if you stay along the horizon, you know you're good. If you start coming up over the horizon, you know you need to kind of fix your tripod level. But just pay attention to how your tripod's set up and how level it is, and that's going to help you out definitely in the long run. Okay, so that's what you need to consider when shooting. So let's go back into Lightroom now. I'll share my screen out and we'll show you how we're gonna put these together. So we're done with this image. I'm gonna go back to my library. I'll go back to my sets of images here. And I'll have 2 examples. One's like a very basic panoramic in the same area that we just shot. We just used the HDR image from, and then I have this other bracketed panorama. You can see that's this set down here where I have 3 shots, an overexposed, an underexposed, and a properly exposed shot for each set. And then we'll merge that together as a panoramic and HDR. But first, before we get into that complication, let's just use these 5 images. So let me delete that one because that's the already merged one. So I have this set that I shot at the waterfall in Eaton Canyon. So I tried to get basically the whole cove and then the little stream that runs off to the side. So what you'll do is you'll just select the images that are part of the panoramic set. In this case, it's these 5 images. Go back up to photo, go to photo merge, and then panorama. And you'll select panorama. And what it'll do is the same little kind of window will pop up. It'll give you a preview of how it's going to look. And then you have some options here for the projection. So when you're creating a panorama, the way it's projected will kind of control how it distorts the lines within the frame. So this one, there's not any straight lines. Like with architecture, this makes a big difference. But with this kind of landscape shot, it doesn't make a huge difference. But basically what projection is you think about it being on the inside of these things. So if you were to project this image on an inside of a sphere, that's what the spherical projection is. So it's kind of showing you how it would wrap on a spherical surface. If you select cylindrical, it's kind of showing you how it'll wrap on a cylindrical surface. So you can see the difference between cylindrical and spherical is that the spherical projection is a little bit shorter and it has a little bit more distortion up to the top sides as if it's kind of curving above or curving below you. The cylindrical kind of keeps those things straight up and down. So it imagines the vertical plane is just continuing on up straight and continuing down straight rather than curving underneath. A lot of the time spherical looks a little bit more realistic, or kind of how it looked in the scene, because that projection is just sort of a little bit more of what we're used to seeing. But you can play with the difference between spherical and cylindrical and see what you like better. In this case, the cylindrical projection had made my foreground a little bit more prominent, and it's actually making that waterfall appear a little bit smaller, whereas the spherical, I think it balances out a little bit better. It's not giving too much emphasis to the foreground. So I prefer the spherical projection. If I select perspective on this, it's gonna look crazy. So it tries to keep all of your lines straight. So it's like really stretching the scene out to the right and the left, but it keeps everything pointed in towards the center of the frame. It almost looks like you're going into hyperspeed in a sci-fi movie or something, where like everything is stretching out really long to the sides and keeping the center about the same size. So again, perspective can be effective for like architectural photography if you're shooting down a hallway or something. But in this case, it's not what I want. So I'm gonna keep it on spherical. And then you have this option for boundary warp. So if you start using this boundary warp tool, you can see what it does is it kind of takes some of that distortion and stretches it back out to look a little bit more realistic. I'm gonna take auto crop off because it's actually gonna be more apparent. So I had auto crop on, which is why you didn't see kind of how it was shaping the images. I had it like that, but now you can see the distortion is causing the image to try to maintain that projection. If I start moving my boundary warp up, you can see it kind of shifts that back out to kind of keep the images how they were. And now that actually looks a little bit more like the cylindrical projection. But I think I'm just trying to assess kind of how I like the image itself, and maybe a little bit of boundary warp is good, just to kind of bring these sides back up a bit. But I don't want to go all the way because I don't think it makes sense to in this case. But again, you just kind of want to look at the image and judge for yourself kind of how it looks. You guys can see as I go to the left on boundary warp, on the left hand side of this image is kind of getting compressed, like as those corners dive in. It's kind of compressing the detail on the rocks there. As I bring the boundary warp up, it allows that to kind of expand back up, and I think that's good. So I think about there looks good. And then I'll select auto crop just so it gets rid of those white areas on the outside. It'll bring my crop lines in to where my whole frame is filled with image. Again, just like auto settings, auto crop can be undone. So you just go back into the crop tool in Lightroom and you can adjust it if you want to later for whatever reason. You do also have an auto settings button here where it just tries to do some auto adjustments for you based on what you'd like. I think it's not doing a good job with them. It's making everything kind of too saturated. So I'm going to leave that off. So what I'll do at this point is I'll just hit merge, and it's going to create a new file in line with the others. Once it's done here. And let's see if it does it. There we go. And here is the new panorama file. And you can see it's got the same naming convention, except this time it says -pano because it's the panoramic file. It's still a DNG. You still have all the editing features that you would with any raw file, and you just go from there. So we won't bother editing this image because we just did a pretty long editing demo on the HDR image. But you would basically go about this the same way. But the thing to remember here is because this is not an HDR composite, it's just one exposure for each of the panels. You're going to be limited to whatever editing you can do with a regular raw file. You're not going to have as great of range. So let's jump back here. Now let's talk about that HDR pano feature, right? So I went ahead beforehand and I did go ahead and make my HDR stacks for each of the sets. So you can see this is my middle exposure, this is my dark exposure, and this is my bright exposure. And then it created an HDR image for each set. So I did a bracket, just like Jennifer, you were talking about, where I did a +1, a -1, and a 0, basically, for each frame. And I went ahead and merged those as HDRs, right? The reason I did that is because when I'll show you, I'm going to select all of the images that are not the merged HDR images, and I'll just go ahead and select the Pano HDR conversion tool. So right there. So I've not selected all of my ones that are the HDR conversion. And then I'll go up here to photo, go to photo merge again, and I have this HDR panorama tool. If I click on that, it has this warning where it says HDR brackets merged with align images on and deghost off. To merge different settings, merge the HDR brackets individually before merging the resulting HDR DNGs to a panorama. So it's aligning the images, but it's not doing any deghosting. And I kind of wanted to see if I needed to do any deghosting before I made the whole composite. Ultimately, I ended up deciding that I did not need to. So this would have worked, but I did want to see if any of them showed that they needed deghosting. But because this is this big desert scene, it really didn't need it at all. And again, we have auto crop selected, so we don't necessarily have to do that. I can look at my different projections and see which one I like the best. Again, since this is a landscape, I'm not trying to maintain a perspective, then I just need to choose between spherical and cylindrical. I think spherical is a little bit better. If I need to do any boundary warping. Yeah, so all right, this one's interesting because you guys can see if I have no boundary warping, that rock feature on the right-hand side is pretty much vertical, which is what I want it to be. If I start doing a boundary warp, that thing starts leaning over to the right-hand side. And even though it fills the frame a little bit better, now that rock feature is leaning, and it wasn't actually leaning when I shot this image. So I probably don't want any boundary, maybe just a tiny little bit boundary warp on, something like that. And then I'll put auto crop on to select it there. If I choose auto settings, you can see what it would do with the HDR image. I can see I'm going to have a whole lot of dynamic range in my sky that I can play with, and a lot of variation in the foreground and the landscape I can play with. So that's going to be cool. But again, I'm not going to put auto settings on because I'm going to do that myself. So what I would do at this point is just hit merge. And while it's doing that, so this was the HDR panorama combined option, which because I was careful, I used a tripod, I did my bracketing appropriately, I can use this functionality. If I wanted to, I could simply take the frames that I already converted to HDRs, in this case all these blue ones, and merge those together as a panorama, and that would basically be the same thing. I would just do them broken out as separate steps. But see, now I have my HDR panorama file, and if I look at the name of it, you can see it is called an HDR Pano file. So this one, again, I would go about editing exactly the same way, the exact same method I did with the original HDR file, and just go from there. And I'm not going to go through that all right now, but just to tell you what I would do with this file. In this case, well, I'll do my basics tab. Whoa, not Twitter. I'll do my basics tabs here just so you can see what I typically would kind of do with that. Okay, so somewhere in there, just to to kind of start off with clarity, give it a little texture. And the thing that's not coming through in this image when I shot it is that this was basically a little bit before sunset. So the light was really kind of this golden orange as it was coming through, seeing the landscape in it. And when I shot it, it looked a whole lot more warm and a whole lot more kind of contrasty than it did in the raw image files. And remember, that's because the raw image file doesn't kind of retain any of the, the saturation and effect that you see on the preview screen from the camera. So on your LCD screen on your camera, it's showing you a JPEG preview of the image. It's not doing any raw processing. So it adds a little bit of contrast, adds a little bit of saturation, and makes it kind of look a lot nicer. A lot of that got lost in the translation here. So what I would want to do with this image is bring that warmth back in, give it that really kind of golden warm effect. I want to bring the sky down a bit and give it a little bit of a darker tonality in blue, because it was just before sunset. So this kind of cyan looks like, you know, midday sky, but I want it to look a little bit more like evening sky. And then one thing that didn't really come across, you can see a little bit here, there's these kind of sun flares that are coming in. The light felt really directional when it was coming through. It really felt like the light was kind of sweeping across the landscape, and you can see the angle of the shadows and things that are created. But I kind of lose a little bit of that in this shot. So what I'd want to do is kind of be able to re-emphasize that by creating some local adjustments that like kind of bring the light through and kind of land on this rock and continue on. And I will edit this shot, and I'll post a tutorial of me editing this shot, but I'm not going to do it right now. I'm not going to take you guys' time up in the live lecture. But I do want to, at this point, kind of open up for discussion and see if anyone has any thoughts they want to add or questions they want to ask about either any of these processes since we're talking about them.
With the magic brush tool, is there a way to actually make a straight line, or is it just based on your personal stroke? So if you wanted to add like God ray streaks into that?
Yeah, let's see. Usually, so like in Photoshop, for example, you can take like a brush tool like this, and let's do something really dramatic so we can see it. You can take the brush tool and you can click once, then you can hold down shift and click again. Yeah, right. And so by doing that, it draws a line between the 2 points, right? So again, I can click up here, hold down shift, click down here, and it basically draws a line. So yeah, there is a way to do that with that tool. I probably wouldn't use that tool to do that. Probably what I would do is use the radial tool and just make it really elongated.
Yeah.
So let me, like for example, in this shot, I would first take the graduated filter tool and bring some of that down up here, duplicate it, rotate down here, right? And so I'm basically starting to try to create a channel for that light to kind of like move through. And then I would take this radial tool and I would draw a really kind of long oval that kind of would cut through the scene, something like this in the direction of that sun. And then the adjustment I would add in is probably a little bit of plus exposure and then a lot of warmth, right? Some magenta, something like that, so that light starts coming through, right? And kind of landing on some of the things that it's cutting across. Something kind of like that. And if I turn that on, if I turn that on and off, you can see like that's kind of how I would create that effect. Now that's a really rough version of it, but that's the idea.
Got it.
Yeah. Right.
So if you want to do anything really fancy, you just go into Photoshop and play with it where you've got a lot more adjustments.
Yeah, you can do a lot. So when I'm shooting with a digital camera, digital SLR, most of the color editing and even like local adjustments that you can do in Photoshop, you can also do in Lightroom. Photoshop, if you need to get really specific into masking, so like bringing in certain adjustments in really precise specific areas, Photoshop's good for that. Photoshop's obviously good for, you know, manipulating the image. So if you want to remove objects or, you know, really, like there's this little town in the background of my image. I'll show you. So I have this, there's way in the distance here, you know, there's this kind of little factory town in the back right there, right? If I wanted to get rid of that, right, and just make it look like this pristine, untouched landscape, then I would need to go into Photoshop to do that. There's really no tool in Lightroom that's going to do that effectively enough that it will look believable.
Yeah.
Anybody else? I'm not entirely sure these people are still here.
People have questions in the chat.
Oh, there's questions in the chat. Okay, let me see. All right, yeah, my chat was minimized there. Okay, from Joyce. Since we're kind of on like lockdown, are we able to use images we've taken before we started class to submit for assignments? That's a good question. Some of the assignments that we're doing are kind of specific in nature. So like the HDR and Panoramic assignment, you need to shoot them a very particular way. So if you've done HDR exposures before. Like these images I did not just go out and shoot. I did them last year. So if you have some that you've done like that, then yeah, I would say it's okay to use those images for the assignment. But if you haven't done any HDR bracketing or panoramic shots before, then you're going to have to shoot those. And obviously, I'm not going to have you drive out to Eaton Canyon, or in this case, Trona, to go take those images. But there's plenty of stuff. Like I think let me share my screen again. I'll show you. When I was doing my example images for the camera control assignment, the lecture I posted, I did some exposures for HDR as well. So you can see I have these bracketed sets for HDR that I could put together. And this, I think this one is one. Yeah, this is an HDR image that I put together from just walking around my neighborhood. So that's, that's totally sufficient. We're just trying to practice the technique, basically, making sure that you can shoot it the way you need to shoot it, and then composite together the way you need to composite it. So, but yeah, if you happen to have images that you've taken before, then you totally could. Okay, and so when we export to our website, you want us to include the metadata. No, you don't have to. You do not have to include the metadata. I'm not going to be diving into those files that deep. You can just, maybe just the copyright data is smart to include, but other than that, you don't need to put in the other stuff. Any other questions?
I had a question about focus.
Yeah, go ahead.
There was a video or YouTube that you linked in the Canvas, like on week 4 or week 5, where he went over focus. Yeah. And it kind of went over my head because there was a little bit of math. And I know you said before, like, if you want deep focus to like, you like your aperture all the way open or whatever. I was like wondering if there's any more practical tips to just making sure you have good focus.
Right. Okay. Focus tips. Yeah. This video. Yeah. So just to bring everybody up to speed on what this guy was talking about in the video, and it is kind of math heavy, and it's not necessary to like do all that math or even follow all that math. But the thing that to remember from this video is, depending on what lens you're using, a wide angle versus a telephoto, you're going to get a different depth of field at equivalent apertures. So if I'm using a 24 millimeter lens, or even a 17 millimeter lens, a really wide angle lens, my f8 is going to give me a much greater depth of field than an f8 would on a 200 millimeter lens, right? So what this guy was saying basically is that with these wider angle shots he was taking, he knew that even at a wide open aperture, he could carry a really great depth of field because of the wide angle nature of the lens, and particularly where you focus within the field, but from foreground to background, there's kind of a specific distance per lens that you can really carry the greatest depth of field, right? So there's math that you can figure out. So, and he kind of goes through that, but basically you can also figure it out by testing, right? So the closer you focus to the camera, the less depth of field you're going to get in general, right? So in the case of the picture that's up here, we have this grass in the immediate foreground. We have sort of the grassy hills in the middle foreground, then that lake or whatever, the shore in the kind of middle distance, and then the mountains in the far background. In this case, he probably focused somewhere in between the two grasses, the middle grass and the foreground grass, where he got sufficient detail on the foreground, but focusing further away from the camera allows you to carry the depth of field even further out towards the mountains. So he probably just did some test shots, focused once on the immediate foreground, focused a little bit further away, focused a little bit further away, and then reviewed those images on the screen of the camera and found the furthest point he could focus away from the camera and still get that grass in the foreground to be in focus. And you can do this test with various apertures, right? But the reason you don't want to use like an f22 and an f32 all the time is because there's what's called diffraction. And as light's passing through smaller and smaller openings, it tends to start bending as it goes through. And that bending, that diffraction, can actually cause your image to get a little bit blurry, a little bit soft. even though it's, if you're shooting at a fast shutter speed or whatever, it's not motion blur, it's just blur from the light having to bend through this very small hole. So the wider the hole, the less diffraction you get. So theoretically, the sharper detail you can get, but then your depth of field gets shallower and shallower. So finding basically the most wide open aperture that you can use, the appropriate place to focus to carry the depth of field you need for each scene is kind of where focusing becomes this really refined kind of conversation. And that's what that video is really trying to explore. But, you know, that's the concept. The math could help you like identify specifically for your lens exactly how far away you should be focusing, but you can pretty easily figure that out just by going through the practice method of what I described, where you know, focus as close as you can basically to the camera, assess the depth of field, and then start focusing a little bit further away, a little bit further away, a little bit further away, until you see those mountains come into focus and still have the grass in focus. And I think he was saying that he shot at like a 2.8 or something for one of these shots, and was able to carry the depth of field all the way through to the mountains and the foreground, and still shoot wide open like that, which is pretty crazy, just finding the right place to focus. Does that help at all?
Yeah, that was super helpful. Thanks.
Okay, cool. No problem. Anybody else? Okay, so due dates. I know there were some questions about when the HDR and Panorama assignments are due. Now that we've talked about it a little bit more, I want to give you guys plenty of opportunity to go out and shoot some, just, you know, locally around if you need to shoot, and then also work on putting them together and really work on your editing techniques. That's the big thing. So making an HDR and making a panoramic are not that hard, but getting them to look really nice through the editing techniques that we've talked about and the editing techniques that they explore in those two sunset editing videos, that's what I really would like you also to practice. So those assignments, I'll make a due date of, let's see, let me open up my calendar here. Not the 11th, which would be next Saturday, but the 18th, which is the Saturday after that. So 2 weeks from today. And just to jump back into those assignments, let me share my screen out with you again. There we go. So coming back into Canvas here, we have that top module of what should be on your website. So we have the image editing and black and white conversion. So that assignment, basically you're gonna just use one raw image file. So any raw image file that you've liked, that you've taken so far in this class, you're going to export a low resolution JPEG with no editing whatsoever, just how the raw file came out of the camera. And then what I'd like you to do is edit the image as best you can using the tools we've discussed in color, and then export a low res version of that, and then create a virtual copy and do a black and white conversion on that shot. So you have a third version that's black and white. And actually I don't think I've shown you virtual copies yet. So let me show you that right now in Lightroom. So virtual copies are really cool because they allow you to make duplicates of a file, but without creating an actual file on your hard drive. It's just a duplicate of the Lightroom file. So let's take this HDR image that we worked on for the majority of this tutorial. And what I'll do is I'll right click on it and I'll say create virtual copy. So I'll click that, create virtual copy, and then it makes a second copy of that file in my catalog. And for whatever reason, it didn't keep my edits on it, but that's okay. What you'd want to do for the black and white conversion virtual and editing assignment 3A is just make your virtual copy right off the bat. So make 2 copies of your original raw file. Oh, no, there it goes. It just took a second to get the adjustments over. So you'll import your raw file. You'll choose the one that you want to edit. You'll make 3 copies. So you have your original copy, 1 virtual copy, and then a second virtual copy. And then you'll do your editing and then your black and white conversion. So for black and white conversions, it's actually really easy to do. You just, in your basic tab, you click on the black and white tab up at the top of that, and it'll throw it over to black and white. But you're not done there, because you might see things differently in terms of the contrast than you did before. Like in this case, it's again much too bright up at the top. Now that we don't have that color up there holding our attention. So what I would do in this case is, like, you know, bring some even more exposure down on the top, just to kind of darken up those trees, make it a moodier shot in general, to bring my focus down back into the the stream. So maybe even something like that, right? And then the really cool thing about black and white conversion in Lightroom is that notice now we don't have a hue, saturation, and luminance tab. We have this black and white tab. And what this black and white tab does is it basically allows you to adjust the luminance of your various regions. So like the tonal range, basically the highlights here, the shadows here, but based on the underlying colors in the image. So again, you have this cool toggle tool. And I remember there was a lot of green in the grasses over here and green in the trees. So if I take my selector tool and I click on an area that I know was green, I can bring that up and down, and you can see it's only affecting the things in my image that were in that green range, but it's just making them either brighter or darker. So I could play with that. I could like make my grasses render a little bit brighter. And then I have these blues down here in this rock, so I can take that and I can bring those up or down depending on how I want them to be. So you can break out your adjustments in your black and white editing based on the colors that exist underneath. And that's what I want you to practice in your black and white conversion, is using this tool to fine tune how your black and white image renders, right? So it would be something like that. And when I go back to my library, now I have my original HDR, my black and white edit, and then in this case, like this original raw file. And those would be the three, I should bring them up. These would be the three images that I would export for that assignment. So it would look something like this, right? Does that make sense to everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. It's actually a kind of cool little set right there. All right. All right, and then the other, actually, let me jump back in to Canvas, right? Because we didn't talk about the other portion of this assignment. So that's 3A. That's, again, due on the 18th. Yep, and then, wait, sorry, not, yeah, 18th, right. And then there's 3B, which is the HDR and Panorama assignment, which is the bigger component of this assignment. And you basically want to create 2 HDR images edited to, to how you believe they should be, and 2 panoramic images edited to how you believe they should look. So 4 images for the 3B assignment, 2 HDR, 2 panoramic, and then ultimately 3 images that you're turning in for the 3A, which are a single image, but edited 3 different ways. Okay. Okay, Peter, sorry, I see this question from you about getting Lightroom and Photoshop on your laptop. I thought I posted in Canvas instructions that the campus sent out. Yeah, so if you go into the files section on our Canvas page, Peter, hopefully you can hear me. There's a file that's called PCC students _ how to download Adobe apps. So that will show you exactly what steps to take to get logged into the Lightroom software through your enterprise account that you guys were using at school. So you have access now through your enterprise account, but at home. Adobe changed their permissions basically on the enterprise's account to allow people to work from home now that we're all confined to home, right? So that was cool of them to do. But that's where you'll find those instructions. So, and Joyce said to everyone, so when we submit, we were to publish our site and just give the URL. Yeah, so when you submit assignments, again, I'll share my screen out so we can see. Go into Canvas. Let me go over to student view so you guys can see all this. When you submit an assignment, you'll click on the assignment. So let's say we're submitting for 3A. I believe I changed this over already. No, this one's actually not. I need to fix this. So let's go back to the camera control assignment. This is how it should be. When you open up an assignment, there should be the submit assignment button up at the top. And what you'll do is you'll click on that, and it brings up this window where you can paste your website URL. So you can simply paste your website to there. Now, you have 2 options with this. Either is fine with me. I don't care. I should be able to figure it out. You can either just paste the URL to your home page on your website, and I'll navigate to the projects where they are. Or you can paste the URL to the specific assignment. So the specific gallery that houses that assignment. So the 3A assignment or the 3B assignment. And if you guys can, please title the galleries with the title I used for the assignment. So like in this case, it's called, it's called assignment 3A, right? So just title it 3A or title it 3B. So just so I can have a little bit easier time finding everything. Anything else you guys want to ask before we end the meeting here?
Could I use a photo from outside the class for the 3 versions of the picture assignment?
Yes,
3A?
yes, that's fine. Since that's just an editing assignment, then yeah, you can use any image you want for that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And when is the HDR Panoramic one due? Is that also on the 18th?
Yes, also on the 18th. So 3A and 3B will all be due 2 weeks from today. Okay, so just so you guys know, moving forward, I'm going to try to do more of these live lectures. We haven't been doing them yet. The college had been kind of waffling on whether or not, well, they were delaying making the decision to close campus down for the remainder of the spring semester, which they finally did. In case you didn't all hear, campus has been shut down for all of spring, likely all of summer as well. It's not for sure yet, but I've heard rumors that we're going to be running summer completely remote as well, but that's not definitive. But anyway, so we were potentially going to get back in the lab and be able to do some stuff, but now we're definitely not. So we're going to figure out ways to conduct critique online. We're going to figure out, how to get more of these kind of group meetings. And then I'm also going to be holding Zoom office hours that I'll post on Canvas so that you guys can check in periodically if you have questions or you just want to talk to me in person, and I can be able to share my screen and show you specifically certain fixes. Like I know there's been some technical questions coming through, and I've done my best to answer them through email, but it's a lot easier if I can just say, okay, here, let me show you how to do that sort of thing on my screen. So keep an eye out for that. I'll probably post like a calendar sign up for Zoom meetings for office hours. So if you need to talk with me, just either email me or sign up for the office hours and we can go from there. Yeah, Jen.
So I'm guessing that we're not going to be doing like the strobe photography and all of that. So stuff where we needed to actually be in the stage.
Right, exactly. So a large portion of the portraiture assignment was going to be in the studio and working with the lights and all that sort of thing, which I will still lecture on, and I'll still talk to you all about how lighting works and the various things that you can do with them, but we're not actually going to be able to do it for the assignment. So what we'll focus on instead is being able to shoot portraiture with found light. So recognizing the light that exists in an environment and figuring out sort of the best way to make a portrait with the given light. You know what I mean? So I'll probably ask you to find examples of certain types of light and make portraits with that light. And we will be flexible on what we call a portrait, right? Because if you guys are self-isolating and there's nobody else in the house, then a portrait of an object would be sufficient. You know what I mean? But the lighting technique.
Or cats.
Or cats. Oh yeah, totally. I've been taking lots of pictures of my kids, right? Because like they're basically the only people I have around that are willing to tolerate me right now. But I have dogs, so I'll probably start taking pictures of my dogs too and show you guys examples of that. So, yeah. Okay. Joyce says, if I were able to create a studio at home, can that work? Yeah, totally. If you have some lights and stuff at home and you want to play around with that, then you guys are more than welcome to do that. And again, if you want specific advice of how you can work with the lights that you have, then we can set up a meeting and I can kind of assess what you have and I can give you some tips and tricks and things like that. But like I said, I'm going to be making tutorials and finding additional resources that already exist that talk about shooting portraiture with available stuff without studio gear. Yes, Lynn. Yeah, so Lynn asked, "Can I recommend cheap light kit?" Yeah, I can. I will post some links to that. So there are a few different kinds of lights that people use, but basically there's continuous lights, which just are like a light bulb that remain on, and then there's strobes, which are a flash, right? And they're basically the same thing in terms of how the looks you can get of images. So there's really nothing different between a big bright light in a softbox that's continuous, or a strobe in a softbox, because the softbox is the thing that's modifying the light, right? So, but continuous versus strobe is sort of like where it breaks, where you really start having these divergent paths in terms of lighting kits. And I will give some examples of both. So cheap continuous light kits and cheap strobe kits. Strobes are kind of universally more useful because they can output more light, so more luminance than a continuous light can, because they focus all their energy into one flash rather than maintaining a consistent power output. So strobes, you can get more light out of, and typically speaking, you can fit more modifiers on them. When you have continuous lights, there's a lot of different flavors of continuous light. Some people make LED light panels, some are like single LED light bulbs, some are, fluorescent banks of lights and things like that. So probably your money is better spent on strobe kits because they have some cheap strobe kits, and then buying modifiers for those kits. But sometimes you need continuous lights. Continuous lights are more of a cinema, problem, because if you're making a movie or you're shooting an interview or something, you need that light to be continuous and always on, versus a still image. You can have that strobe just flash and turn off, and you don't have to worry about it in between shots. So yeah, Jen.
I'm just curious. I was looking into getting a accessory flash that you can tilt up, that's got a diffuser on it and all of that.
Yeah.
Will you be going over that type of flash photography as well?
I definitely can. In fact, I brought one home just in case we wanted to. So Anna said it's a nice strobe and it's cheap. So there's this company called Godox, which is Godox, and they make they're like Tamron or Sigma for lenses, right? So Tamron and Sigma make copies basically of Canon and Nikon lenses and just cheaper. So Godox is doing that for like lighting gear. So strobes and reflectors and different things like that. So I have this pretty nice Godox hot shoe flash, which is, Canon. It's a knockoff of Canon's like $800 flash, but I got it for, I want to say it's like $125 or something like that. And people really like it. So I'll demonstrate that, and I'll put some links up online as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, that takes us pretty much right up to noon, where we were going to end. So like I said, you guys, if there are more questions, you can go ahead and reach out to me via email, and I can either answer them in email, or we can set up appointments. But do continue to look on Canvas and try to go over all the material and content that I'm putting up there, because it's going to be helpful. And those editing tutorials are incredibly helpful. And they're nice because you can pause them and go back and see what they're doing and all those sorts of things. So I strongly recommend you watch the Lightroom editing tutorials that I'm putting up. Those are, I got a long way. So, Lightroom's a relatively new program. We didn't have it when I was in college. So I've been having to learn Lightroom on my own outside of a classroom. So I did like a basic introduction course, like on Lynda, just to understand the layout of it. And then I expanded my knowledge through all these various tutorials that people are putting up online. And it's a really helpful way to learn about the specific tools in Lightroom. So I'll keep on directing you guys to ones that I think are helpful, but break out on your own too. Explore YouTube and see if there's things that you can find that are, maybe relate more to specifically what you want to do. I kind of tend to look for, landscape specific stuff, because I do a lot of landscape photography, but there's a lot of stuff out there on portraiture. There's a lot of stuff out there on still lifes and editorial photography and these sorts of things. So keep your eyes peeled on that. And Joyce, no, I'm not taking attendance. So the only way that attendance is not factored in as part of the grade anymore, but assignment completion is basically what we're looking at now. So just make sure you get your assignments in on time, and that you're finishing up the course content, and we should be fine. Okay, thank you, everybody. I think this was a good format, and I'll try to continue doing live meetings as often as possible. But I'll always put up on Canvas an announcement when it's going to be. So it may not be every Saturday, but I'll try to do it most Saturdays. All right, and I'm going to end the meeting now. So I hope all of you have a good rest of your day, and I'll fix the assignments on Canvas, the 3A and 3B assignments, to have the submit button and also have a due date on them. All right, have a good one.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.